Well, thank y'all so much for coming today. It's a little bit after 3 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. The yellow fever epidemic, particularly in 1878 in Memphis, has been a topic that has been so discussed. If you grew up in Memphis, even if you didn't, and did any study at all about epidemics in the country, it's been actually brought up with the advent of COVID in the last year about the effect of yellow fever in the United States. Anyway, it's just a well-discussed topic, and I kind of hesitated about doing it today, but I had come across a new video clip that I had not seen before, and it made it a little more interesting to me. And I want to also bring your attention, and I think I already have at some point, but I wanted to remind you again. This is a marvelous book. It's called The American Plague, and it's written by Molly Caldwell Crosby, and she is a Memphian. It was on the New York Times bestseller list back years ago when it was published, and it's been, I'd say, 10 years. Am I right? Can't find the date. 2006, so it's been longer than that, 15 years. It's been 15 years ago. Molly is usually, and you can run into her if you ever go to a novel bookstore. It used to be Davis Kid. You'll probably bump into her. And you'll know her because everybody will say, "Hey, Molly, how's it going?" But she's written some marvelous books, The American Plague, about the yellow fever epidemic. She's written another one called The Great Pearl Heist, about a jewel thief in London, England. A lot of her stories take place in late Victorian, early Edwardian times. Her degree is from Johns Hopkins University, and it was in nonfiction writing, and that's exactly what she does, and she's very good at it. So hopefully one of these days we can get her out here and let her talk to you. In essence, we're kind of going to get her out here today, because I'm going to show a clip of it. Memphis had gone through, for almost all of its life, had gone through periods where they had yellow fever. And we know what causes yellow fever, right? What? Mosquitoes. Well, they didn't know that back then. They thought it was miasmatic odors that caused the yellow fever. And one of the things that had happened as Memphis had grown up, we know Memphis was founded as a city in 1819. Obviously by the river, it became a transportation hub with river traffic and later, of course, railroads. But Memphis was a filthy city. Sanitation, even by standards in the 1800s, was very poor in Memphis. They had no sewer system whatsoever. So people were dumping trash, garbage, refuse, human waste, certainly horses, all the nasty stuff that you could imagine was in Memphis. And you could see where they might think miasmatic odors would cause this disease. So what time, if you've got streets full of horse dung, in what time of the year would you think that would be worse to smell? Summertime. Well, guess when yellow fever usually hit? It's summertime. So the connection between the two was not totally unfounded. Of course, this uncovered refuse, uncovered trash also brought what with it? Mosquitoes. And so the mosquitoes is what was causing the yellow fever. But nobody knew that at the time. And what we're going to, I'll do two things real quick, and then we'll watch the clip, which I think you'll find very interesting. If you go to Elmwood Cemetery today, you'll see a section of it dedicated to yellow fever victims. You'll see some statues dedicated to the doctors and nurses that helped yellow fever victims and gave their lives for the people that had contracted the disease. It got so bad in the summer of 1878 that they were bringing carts up and down the streets in Memphis, and they were yelling, "Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!" And for days and days, people would go unburied. and they're going to explain a little bit about the disease, why it was called yellow fever, yellow jack, and they'll explain it a lot better than I can in it. But when you contracted it, you eventually ended up with a saffron-colored skin, which is where it got its name. It's interesting. One of the odd things I learned that I had never heard about this before I read Mary's book and had never heard it in another place. You know the Memphis area of town called the Pinch District, which is downtown by the river. Well, number one, they thought all these miasmatic odors were coming from the Gayoso Bayou, which is down by the river. And honestly, even today, is still a problem with drainage and some of the other issues that they have. But the Pinch District got its name from Irish immigrants who were coming up the river. And so they settled right next to the river in Memphis. Now, why was it called the Pinch District? Anybody know? These people were so starved and hungry that their stomach was pinching up against their backbone. So it was called pinch gut. And later it was shortened to Pinch. And that's how Memphis got its Pinch District. I know y'all are looking like you making this up, Mark. It's the truth. That's where they got it. Let me skip ahead about 100 years, 150 years, if I didn't lose my place. From 1878, a little more than that. In March 10th, 2002, when Tim McCulloch checked into the emergency room in Corpus Christi, Texas, he had been suffering for 4 days from cramping, abdominal pain, and severe headache. There he developed a fever approaching 103 degrees. The doctors in the emergency room thought it could be rickettsial disease, a term that covers a number of infections caused by vectors like ticks, fleas, or contacts with animals. Most rickettsia can be controlled with antibiotics, so the doctors prescribed just that and released him from the hospital. 2 days later, he was back again, this time with intractable vomiting. McCulloch had been a healthy 47-year-old man, but now he appeared weak and febrile. He repeatedly asked his wife, "What's happening to me?" After a series of tests were performed, he was treated for malaria, though his blood test proved negative. McCulloch developed anemia. His blood would not clot. His kidneys and liver failed. He went into shock and developed seizures. He bled uncontrollably from the sites of his needle punctures. Tim McCulloch died on March 15th, leaving a wife and 6 children, and nobody knowing why he died. If you had gone back to Memphis in 1878, they would have known exactly what was wrong with him. He had yellow fever. He had visited in South America some weeks before and had gotten bitten by a mosquito that he didn't remember, and so he couldn't tell the doctors what they thought had happened. His body had never come in contact with the virus before, and his blood came from a stock that had not seen this virus in over a century, and so it killed him. And yellow fever is around today, by the way. Absolutely it is. So, yellow fever comes to Memphis in 1878. By the way, there was a medical board in Memphis at the time, fairly distinguished physicians, who understood that this was going to happen in the summer. It always happened. There were some summers that were worse than others, and 1878 was going to prove terribly horrible for the city of Memphis. And so they understood that when ships were coming up from New Orleans, that those ships ought to be properly quarantined for a while so the doctors could go aboard and see if anybody was sick. Well, on August 1st, 1878, a man named William Warren, a deckhand from the Golden Crown, landed in Memphis and visited an Italian snack shop in the Pinch District. The Pinch was the closest neighborhood to the river wedged between the Wolf River and the Gayoso Bayou. Here the river traffic congregated. It was not uncommon to hear drunken laughter and the roll of dice. Gambling, prostitution, and drunkenness flourished. The next morning, William Warren grew feverish. Dr. Erskine was notified. He was head of the Department of Health. Once again, admitted the man to a quarantine hospital on President's Island, where he died 3 days later of yellow fever. Warren's case never went on record. The first case to go on record for the public was not for 12 more days when Miss Kate Biondi, owner of the Italian snack house where Warren had visited, died from the fever on August 13th. Hers was officially reported by the Board of Health as the first official case of yellow fever in the city for that summer. The body of Mrs. Biondi was burned within 5 hours of her death. On that day, the Commercial Appeal published a warning: the sad case of Mrs. Biondi, who had left 2 little children and a grief-stricken husband, does not necessarily prove that we will have other cases of yellow fever. There is no need for a panic or a stampede. Only 2 cases of yellow fever went on record that day, but by that time, at least 22 had already existed, and the city was well on its way to a pandemic. So let's watch the clip. Mark can get this working. Yes. Yeah. And there's a restaurant down there that I can't think of at the name, but they have got the best chocolate brownie in the whole wide world. Somebody ought to know that. What's the restaurant down there? I can't think of it. They also have a Shell station right before you go on Mud Island that's got the highest gasoline within 20 states prices. Because back when gas was about $1.39, and my wife we were living down in Harbor Town, you know, everywhere else would gas be $1.30, $1.50. You stop at that Shell station, it's $2.99. They knew they had you because there wasn't nowhere else to get gas downtown. There just wasn't. So if you're about out, you had to get it at the Shell station, and buddy, they knew it. Also, well, that's beside the point. I used to, they've got a turnaround. How many of y'all drive down to Harbor Town, Mud Island? You've seen it. Miss Cordelia's is down there, great. Well, they've got a turnaround. Well, that was one of the first ones in the city, and I'd never seen one before, and apparently all the people I drive with hadn't either. So about every 2 weeks, we hear somebody just, you know, had flipped into the turnaround. They'd gone over it, through it. It's a little getting used to it. And now the city's got a lot of them, but that was one of the first. No. Yes, it has. That's sad. Is it the north end?
No.
I can't. I heard that. Well, you.
What did she say?
If she was my age, she would remember. All right, I'll get this in a second here. No, ma'am. There is a vaccine?
Yes.
Really? Ah, well.
And she got it here, and it's a matter of fact.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because within a few days after this word got out that Memphis had yellow fever, people were just abandoning the city. I mean, just fleeing as fast as they could. And the towns away from Memphis, in Brownsville, Bolivar, north of Memphis and St. Louis, south of Memphis, they had armed guards at the railroad stations. If you were from Memphis, they wouldn't let you off the train. I mean, they didn't want you anywhere near their city. I think we might have found it. Let's see. Maybe not. I promise you guys, this worked really well for about, please. Might have to call Kaylee. How is this not showing up? It's just amazing to me. Oh well. I'm determined to find it. Thank you. Yay! Only took, what, 4 hours?
It's a hemorrhagic fever, which puts it in the same category as Ebola. It was gruesome. People's eyes, ears, mouths, anything could bleed because the virus was attacking the blood vessels. And internally, the same thing was happening. So one of the most common symptoms of yellow fever was what they referred to as black vomit. It was actually digested blood from internal hemorrhaging. It attacked the brain as well, so there was a lot of delirium that went on with it, which I think was very disturbing to the people caring for yellow fever victims. And the last organ usually to fail was the liver, and when it did, it releases a surge of bile which turns the jaundice, the body and whites of the eyes yellow. In the body's attempt to fight off this virus, it caused these high fevers. So it was typical to see a fever at 105, 106. Some of the Memphis doctors who were performing autopsies during the epidemic said that it felt like the organs had literally were boiling at the time of autopsy.
Memphis was no stranger to yellow fever. The grim disease had visited the city at least 3 times in its history. In mid-June of 1878, word came upriver confirming that yellow fever was in New Orleans. That same month, Dr. Robert Wood Mitchell, one of 3 doctors on the Memphis Board of Health, called for money to initiate a quarantine. But a quarantine would have done nothing to stop disease-carrying mosquitoes from entering the city. 19th century medicine had no knowledge or tools to cope with such an invasion. They believed that the disease was caused by poisonous miasmas that emanated from the Gayoso Bayou. On August 13th, the Board of Health announced the first yellow fever death in Memphis.
But that official case is really what marked this mass exodus out of the city. And people described it just as, you know, they would get on anything that would float in the Mississippi. They would get on the trains, wagons, anything they could to get out of the city as quickly as possible. Some people left doors open and their tables still set with silver, was how one person described it. So with a population of about 40 to 45,000, they estimated 25,000 people fled, about half the population at the time, and this was in a matter of 3 days.
The remaining population of some 19,000 people were witness to a daily roll call of the dead that wouldn't stop until the arrival of the first frost.
My darling little daughter, we are in the midst of death and desolation. Today we are alive, but tomorrow may find us dead. victims of one of the most terrible plagues that ever desolated any country. Nothing seems to stop the progress of this grim destroyer. Frost is our only hope, which seems far in the distance. Julia Rain.
Here you have like this picture of heavy plumes of smoke going up in the air. Had a strong smell to it. Dead bodies, coffins out, waiting to be picked up. People avoiding contact with other people, armed people, and the cannon firing. It had to be, as again, reminiscent of Dante's Inferno.
It got really just horrific in the city itself. The undertakers were burying people in mass graves because they couldn't keep up with the amount, the bodies that were coming through. They would locate bodies by buzzards, anything they could, just throughout the city. And a lot of the houses had been marked they would hang up a piece of cardboard, a black piece of cardboard for someone who had died, and put the dimensions of the coffin needed. So a couple of times a day, the undertaker would come through the city and round up the bodies and put them in the coffins and take them to Elmwood and put them in the big mass grave that has close to 1,500 unidentified bodies in it now.
Medical science of the 19th century had no clue as to the cause of yellow fever, and few weapons with which to fight a disease that could kill within a matter of hours.
And there were several Memphis physicians, Dr. Robert Wood Mitchell, Dr. Gustavus Thornton. Dr. Thornton said, you gave them a good emetic, that is, you gave them a good cleaning out, and then you gave them fluids and total bed rest and nothing else.
I think for the doctors, a lot of it just was managing these houses. They would enter a house and find the father and the mother dead in the bed with the children, sick on the floor, and would not know how many hours or days that the children had been left unattended. It was just horrific all around. So a lot of what the doctors did was just feed people, take them water, and get the undertakers to remove the bodies.
By early September, the disease was averaging 200 deaths per day. Coffins were stacked on the streets awaiting burial. Fever fires burned, and in the distance was the sound of cannons being fired across the Gayoso Bayou in an effort to clear the air of poisonous miasmas. It was said you could smell death from 3 miles outside the city limits.
It taxed every resource that was available. Doctors made house calls just night and day, and a number of the volunteer doctors who came here in 1878 died because they themselves contracted yellow fever, and they were exhausted.
111 physicians were under the direction of Dr. Robert Wood Mitchell of the Howard Association. Many of these doctors were volunteers from as far away as New York. And 3,000 nurses, many of them African American, assisted as best they could. One of the Howard physicians was Dr. William J. Armstrong, a survivor of the 1873 epidemic, who wrote letters to his wife and 8 children who had fled Memphis at the onset of the disease. From Dr. Armstrong's letters, we can envision a city gripped by fear and despair.
August 24th, my dearest one. The outlook grows more gloomy each day and gives no promise of a break short of frost. What a fight it will be, and how ceaseless. No one but the poor worn-out physicians know what it is. Kiss my dear children for me. And I do hope God will spare us all to meet at the old fireside soon.
He wrote these very touching letters to his wife throughout the epidemic. He was helping take care of the nuns and the St. Mary's community there that had set up sort of a makeshift hospital, mainly for the orphaned children, a lot of the children that were left behind when their parents died.
September 3rd. I do not see how it is possible for me to work through it all. How I did it before, I do not know, but this is worse than all. The numbers of deaths as reported are frightful. Yesterday, 208. But that is simply the accumulation of what Jack Walsh could not bury, and not the deaths for that day. Some of the bodies lie 3 and 4 days unburied and produce horrid smells in the locality. I wish I could go to some secret spot where there would be no burning heads and hands to feel, nor pulses to count, It is fever, fever all day long.
The altruistic spirit of medicine is embodied in the bravery of the doctors, nurses, and volunteers who fought the fever. Of the 111 Howard physicians, 54 were stricken by the disease, and 33 died.
September 10th. One by one, the Howards and the doctors are falling. Out of 5 of us at the drugstore, Dr. Sam and A.B. are in Virginia, Humes is dead, and Channing down with a pretty bad case. September 11th. My dearest one, it is now nearly 9 o'clock and I have just gotten in. Channing is very low tonight, and I fear the worst will come. Of all the 5, I alone am standing.
Those words ended Dr. Armstrong's last letter. He took ill with the fever on September 16th and died 4 days later on the 20th. He was buried in Elmwood Cemetery. On the night of October 18th, the long-prayed-for killing frost arrived. Of the 19,000 people who had stayed in Memphis, an estimated 17,000 contracted yellow fever, and 5,150 died.
The numbers of deaths were higher than the Chicago fire, the San Francisco earthquake, and the Johnstown flood combined. And to even put that in perspective today, more people died in that epidemic than we lost on 9/11. More people died in that epidemic than Pearl Harbor, and more people died than Hurricane Katrina.
In many ways, the old river town that was Memphis died in 1878 and would be replaced by a new city that grew up in the 1880s.
That's a good video, isn't it? It's a meaningful clip.
Savannah, Georgia, 1820.
A couple of things I wanted to point out, minor things, but they kind of struck me. The first thing is, you know, it told you that there were thousands and thousands that were leaving Memphis, and yet there were thousands and thousands that stayed. Why do you think the people that stayed? Couldn't afford to leave, had nowhere else to go. And if you look, it's kind of interesting to me, and we've talked over the years, it's become more of a sociological story, but diseases like this tend to affect poor people more than they do the wealthy, because the poor people, they've got nowhere to go. If you think of, some of y'all I'm sure remember Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Well, the people that were left in the city were the people who couldn't get out. There wasn't anywhere else for them to go. And the same thing occurred here in this yellow fever epidemic in Memphis. The people, they couldn't get out. They had nothing to do. The other thing that I've noticed, I've read a ton of Civil War diaries and histories and all that kind of stuff, and it kind of tends to play on it. We have lost the art over the years of writing. Do you notice how poignant and meaningful they write to each other? I don't know that we can do that anymore, because we've got the phone, we've got iPads, all that kind of stuff, and it's just you almost get a clearer picture of situations when you can read what they're saying rather than get it through an iPad or an iPhone. We've lost kind of a personal touch with that, and you get a sense of that person's love for his wife or his children, his sense of purpose, his dedication to his profession as a physician. Anyway, I kind of missed that about historians. There's one other point I want to make, and hopefully I can find this one. It won't take near as long. We talked a couple of weeks ago in our history class a lot about prostitutes. And I wanted to give a shout out to a Memphis prostitute. I should have her name. I think they've got her name in here. Always a holler. Annie Cook. She's called the hero hooker of Memphis. Sometime after the Civil War, and you remember, of course, during the Civil War, Memphis was not anywhere near as devastated as, say, Atlanta or Vicksburg, because they had surrendered, say without a fight, but as far as the city was concerned, there was not much bloodshed from battle inside the city. So sometime during the early part of the Civil War, this lady had kind of come into Memphis and operated a bordello, house of prostitution downtown, and was pretty good at it. They were making a lot of money. A lot of famous Memphis people would be seen in the bordello. But during the yellow fever epidemic, she turned it into a hospital, and she and the other prostitutes were taking care of patients. I find that remarkable. And she was buried at Elmwood, and she is called today a hero of Memphis City. One thing I wanted to mention to you, I don't know if you remember, we talked a little bit about Calamity Jane a couple of weeks ago, and also mentioned that she had made a lot of her money as a prostitute. Another point about Calamity Jane that I didn't mention the other day, she also did some time as a nurse. And even when she was drinking a lot and doing some stuff she wasn't supposed to be doing, if people were sick in the community, she would go take care of them. Interesting that you find those two sides of people's personalities. Or maybe they're one and the same, they just show themselves up in different ways. So Memphis hired a man who had designed the drainage system from Central Park in New York. They got him to come down, and so the sewer system was designed in Memphis and has improved dramatically. But again, during the summertime, you'll see mosquito trucks going up and down the city spraying, and you can smell them at night if you get out because the yellow fever is still a problem, and they have to take care of it. And I think, yes, ma'am. Well, at the same time, there was several doctors working on it in South America, because when they had built the Panama Canal, this was obviously after the yellow fever epidemic, but they were losing a lot of the people who were working on the canal to yellow fever, so they sent a commission from the United States down to Panama to study the effects of the mosquito. They finally realized that's where it was coming from, the mosquitoes. The most famous of these doctors would be Walter Reed. It's not called that now. It used to be the Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington. I think they call it, well, no, it's Joint Base Andrews Medical, but anyway. So it would be a number of years before they actually discovered that's what was causing it. It's also been said that this disease probably killed more doctors who were trying to find out what was wrong with it than any other disease. Because many of the doctors, particularly when they were doing these experiments with mosquitoes down in South America, they would allow themselves to be infected and then record the results and the treatment. And you might have seen the treatment, or the lady that was talking about the doctors in Memphis who were treating the yellow fever. They didn't know what to do. They basically, gave you, cleaned you out inside, and then gave you clear liquid and tried to keep the fever down. That's all they knew to do. And for so many thousands, it wasn't enough. Yes, ma'am. A simple definition would be odd odors in the air. It's not mystical necessarily, but if you and we were talking about it, if you saw a lot of the cases were centered initially, of course, down around the Gayoso Bayou, which also was basically a trash dump. That's where all the refuse and sewage would go, or sewer stuff, and clearly there would be odors coming out of that. And they thought that was what was causing it. They also mentioned that across the river in West Memphis, which wasn't called that at the time, but across the river, they'd fire cannons so it might disperse these odors in the air, which, of course, obviously weren't going to happen. But yes, ma'am. There were several, but here's the issue with Memphis. Number one, it had a large population. So in a smaller population, it would affect it, but you wouldn't see the results because you had 2 or 3. If you lived on a small area, say coming up the Mississippi, maybe a little community, the sewage problem would not be as bad. There were not the same number or there wouldn't be as number of ships coming up from New Orleans to stay in your city as they were in Memphis. The yellow fever people who came up, who infected a lot of the Memphis population, initially it started in Cuba. And Cuba went to New Orleans on a ship, and the quarantine in New Orleans came and let it go and let it come on upriver. So it initiated in Cuba is where the disease, not where it started, but where this particular source came was from Cuba through New Orleans and up to Memphis. So it didn't stop at these other places where people would have gotten off the boat. But Memphis was a large port of... Right. It would have been terrible. The whole Mississippi Valley would get it until you went further up north. And of course, the first frost is what killed the mosquitoes. So the further north you would get, the frost would come earlier in the year and wouldn't see as large of effect as it would have had in Memphis or points south.
So you're saying that you could give it to me as well as a mosquito could give it to me?
Yes, I think. Isn't that right? It'd have to, almost. Everybody would have gotten. Yeah.
Well, but you sold sugar.
Yeah, it has to be. Yes, ma'am. You'd think. Here was another issue for Memphis, particularly in 1878. We know from Memphis background, big Cotton Carnival. Well, that year, the Cotton Carnival was in, I think, late March, early spring, and they always had big crowds for Memphis Cotton Carnival, but this year they had upwards of 100,000. Huge crowds for Memphis at the time. So there were more people in the city at the time than normally would have been through the Cotton Carnival. There was just more people who would have likely had a chance to get infected with the disease. It has to be passed on. It really does. I don't see how.
Well, for the first time, I just assumed they were both bitten because his wife and children lived.
Well, and they knew, for example, that quarantining, if they could do it right, was effective. So they knew keeping people who had it away from people who didn't could stop it. So to the degree that it could be stopped. I mean, if they hadn't gotten that guy if that guy from New Orleans hadn't ever gotten off the boat in Memphis, they might not have ever had it to the degree that it ended up being. But can you imagine? I mean, Memphis, I think, proper has 640,000. Can you imagine what would be the percentage? 320,000 people up and leaving in 3 days? What that would make this city look like? Good night, nurse. Ghost town. And that's what it was, and it eventually ended up being a city of ghosts because a lot of the people had died in here. Memphis went bankrupt. They were in poor financial shape before the epidemic. The epidemic bankrupted them, so they lost their charter. They had to be rechartered by the state. Some say Memphis is not in too good a financial shape now, but we'll see how all that goes. I don't know. My taxes didn't go up. That's a good thing. My property tax sure did. Holy smokes.
The property values have gone up.
They have. Yeah, they have. Any questions that I can make up? No, actually, I kind of knew something a little bit about this. Thank y'all for coming. I apologize for not doing it last night. I was just flat wore out. Just kind of got pooped out. I hope you have a very safe Memorial Day. I think they're going to feed you good on Monday. If you get a chance, in the entrance, we will have, it's called America's Table, and it will be set for someone who has died serving their country. And we'll have the setting, and you can read the little information thing that's on there. But we hope it's not a lot, but it's meaningful, I think, if you kind of read it and kind of understand what's going on. Thank y'all very kindly. I hope you have a good night. Tim Stanek coming tonight. Yeah. He's really good.